1,800 students.
So we had him last year.
This is a lady.
Oh, it was a woman? We had her, so it's a woman and a guy, her assistant professor.
Yeah.
And we had the assistant professor come in last year. And,
It was
and
wonderful.
that whole happiness project is amazing. Yeah, the good life.
It is.
Yeah.
Teaching kids how to be happy.
Chief of the auditorium.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we built most of the church.
Also,
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to St. Andrews for the invitation. It is indeed a real pleasure to be here at this time of year, even though it's been an oddly warm winter in South Bend. Of course, we've got many twists and turns. We're in the middle of one of those, going from 70 degrees to 25 degrees in the last week. So I was quite happy to get on the plane, and very happy to spend just a few hours here on the beach. I hope to do another walk later. What a gorgeous place, just unbelievable. So the heavy work of trying to understand faith is something that I do take seriously. I've committed my career really to trying to write as a 20th century U.S. historian, a modern U.S. historian, who tries to kind of reveal surprising ways in which religion does intersect with the mundane, with areas of life that you might not think are necessarily sacralized in any way. I've done work on religion and politics extensively. That's really been a focus of mine over the last 15 to 20 years. Now doing more work on intersection of religion and environment, religion and energy. And after this afternoon, I am convinced the next book needs to be Religion and the Beach or something of that sort. I think my colleagues in religious studies would think that's really, really sexy in some way. So I might go in a less conventional route, but there's so much to say, no doubt, about the intersection of religion and leisure, and there's been some great work already written on that. But for today, and again, hopefully you can make out the slides to some degree here. I know they're going to be a bit shaded, but I would like to talk about the intersection of religion and energy. This is related to a book that was published recently, Anointed with Oil, How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America, but also to think not just about oil, more broadly about energy, and then of course the ways in which that intersection of those, what might be thought of in separate kind of individual terms, has really shaped our politics, has shaped, more importantly, life on energy patches, on oil patches across North America and beyond. And that, again, also raises questions, challenges about understanding our own approaches to energy, approaches to environment and land care going forward. But we can leave those as open-ended as we move through. My project, from a scholarly standpoint, as I've just indicated, is really to speak to scholars who have, up to this point, either focused solely on kind of religion and religious history, the study of religion on its own terms in the United States, or on energy. And so often, perhaps you've read books of the sort. Histories of energy tend to be written with economics, with technology, with the material itself as the centerpiece, which of course makes sense and is of great value to us if we want to understand so much of the last century and a half of development in the United States and abroad, as well as politics and geopolitics. My goal in writing this book was to bring the two together and say that, quite simply, for those of you who study energy in strictly materialist, structuralist terms, you need to be aware of how this resonates at the local level through culture, and in important ways through the pulpits and pews of American life writ large. Some scholars recently who would call themselves students of the energy humanities have done a great work in bringing culture to bear on our understanding of energy. What's it like to work, to play in a zone of extraction related to coal? How does that differ in response or in comparison to what it means to work and to play and to live in an oil patch? My charge to them has been, well, what about worship? How does religion itself take root in an oil patch, for instance, or in a zone of coal extraction that is perhaps unique? How is theology shaped in response to extraction of this material, and the ways in which that extractive process, in fact, shapes the daily routines and the ways we view the here and now and the thereafter? So how do we blend religion, spirituality with our understanding of these different energy resources? So in order to do that, I have spent considerable time over the last decade revisiting life on the oil patches of North America. I'll say just a bit about my own experience growing up on an oil patch, and dealing, of course, talking with people about their lived religious experience and trying to make sense of the histories of those places as they can be viewed through a relationship with a particular energy sector, such as oil. Bringing to bear, of course, questions of the present. How do our histories of these places help us make sense of what is at stake with some of the questions about energy transitions, about environmental and land care and so forth, as well as about some of the fierce, heated debates that currently animate our society, certainly animate our politics in relation to these materials. On the oil patches that I've spent most time on, there is, of course, fierce debate, pushback against those who would like to do away with carbon-based energy, oil. There is also a healthy amount, I think, of conversation, a healthy amount of give and take, and engagement. And what I've been pleased to see is the ways in which that is often coming from those who are occupying the pulpits and the pews of these places. And that would be, I think, one of the takeaways for our current circumstances from my work and from my talk. So how did we get to this place where, as I see it, we need to understand a resource such as oil in terms of a religious biography? And this is what I seek to do in this book, is tell a religious biography of petroleum in modern North American life. This comes out of a journey that is very personal, and as scholars, of course, we try not to wear our own biographies on our sleeve too much, especially when it comes to religion. Heaven forbid that you are seen as advocating a particular theology in the secular academy. But for our purposes today, I wear it on my sleeve quite openly and proudly. My own childhood was shaped profoundly by the intersection of religion and oil. Grew up in Alberta, Canada, Edmonton, Alberta. Has anyone been there? Oh, wow. Okay, a few of you. Of course, one of the most northern cities of that size in the world. Dictated its economic rises and falls. The booms and busts of oil very much dictate patterns of daily life in that oil patch zone. And during the late 1970s, early 80s, when I was coming to understand who I was, my family, and my community better, including my church community, it was, of course, happening at a pretty profound moment in the history of energy in North America, globally as well. Of course, the second energy crisis of the late 1970s, driven by politics of geopolitics in the Middle East and so forth, creating, of course, domestic crises, long lineups. I'm sure some of you, maybe most of you, remember those lineups pictured here to the left. I think that's from the second energy crisis, not the first one of the early 70s. And all of this, of course, had momentous effects on American politics and American political culture, and also in terms of local communities and how they wrestled with these dire circumstances. Those in the coal fields were dealing with their own energy crisis related to coal. Mechanization was driving advancements in new mining techniques, but that was also having an effect on labor, which of course reacted in protest of that. 3 Mile Island, late 70s, nuclear energy reaching a crisis point too. Virtually every energy sector is between 1977 and 1980 reaching a crisis point. Dams collapsing, New Deal infrastructures are collapsing. This is going to be the number one problem that President Jimmy Carter faces, and it is indeed quite unprecedented. That's when I first recall kind of growing up. I don't know, I often ask my students, what is the first image that they remember, that they recall? And I swear, I think mine was being in the car with my dad waiting for oil, waiting for gas, and thinking to myself, that's my dad. Now, I don't think that's far-fetched. I'm pretty sure that's, that is what happened, but it was right around this time that I developed my own kind of certainly awareness of my surroundings, but also a greater awareness of, again, the theology that dictated my life, my family's life, as well as the political outlook. And that was shaped by a combination of kind of a fervent evangelicalism. My dad was a pastor at the time of a Christian Missionary Alliance church. And from the pulpit, we would hear messages that very seamlessly combined the fear of end times, the urgency of salvation, personal salvation, with critiques of Islam and Muslim oil producers who had taken the livelihoods out of Albertans who were so invested in oil at that time. There was fear of a centralized kind of liberal state, Ottawa in this case, not Washington, D.C., that was critiqued also in terms of its secular humanism and so forth. Only in kind of looking back on these years did I come to fully appreciate just how seamless this blend of theology, worldview, with local circumstances rooted in the rise and fall, in this case, the fall of Alberta oil in the late 70s, early 80s, that had an impact on me personally as a young person who was growing up. We don't need to get into the political details of this, but as crisis unfolds in Alberta, oil prices drop. This is catastrophic for the economy. In steps Pierre Trudeau, father of Justin Trudeau, of course, who is going to activate a national energy program, which is going to centralize. And again, this raises absolute, not just fear, but protest among Albertans that once again the central government is overstepping its bounds and is taking the resource that we own, that we manage for someone else's good. So there is, again, a very personal experience with the lived religion and life on an oil patch that did shape my own personal background, and that has, consciously or not, informed how I've written this book. And indeed, it was a pleasure to kind of revisit my own roots and to be able to talk about this project to Albertans who are still making sense of the rise and fall, the booms and busts of a petro economy, and trying to make sense of it, not just in purely economic terms or terms of labor, but in theological terms as well. So let me kind of step back and move from the personal to the more scholarly, the work that I did to tell this religious biography of oil through a century and a half of American history. Canada does factor in. I do very much center, as much as I can, of the Alberta story into broader strands of American political and economic and religious development, and you'll get a glimpse of this in just a second. But the crisis that I just talked about through my own personal experiences of the late 70s, early 80s, and again, I'm sure you all have stories you could tell about that time period and just how disruptive it was, of course, was also captured in highly moralistic language by President Jimmy Carter at the time, who made energy one of his number one concerns. He spoke on it regularly, opened his administration in 1977 with a speech on energy in which he called the quest to answer the energy crisis was the moral equivalent of war. Critics would later make fun of that speech as the meow speech. But nevertheless, Carter was tapping into concerns at this moment that energy and what it had created for American life was now raising costs that were heavy as well. And those weren't just economic, they were moral, they were spiritual. And then more famously or infamously, perhaps in 1979, he delivered his Crisis of Confidence speech, when again, he talked to the American people, much to the chagrin of many of his advisors who'd warned him against preaching to the American public. But the true kind of Southern Baptist, earnest evangelical Baptist that he was, got the better of him, and he talked about the energy crisis once again as a crisis of the American spirit, seeing this in theological terms. So I want to take the lead of Jimmy Carter, and also again against the backdrop of my own personal experience, to offer you a narrative of how this was indeed a right kind of interpretation of energy in American life up to the late 70s and beyond to our present day. How do we make sense of this? I like to think of it in terms of teaching as well as working at this through different altitudes. Oil and religion, Christianity and crude, seen as a narrative at three different levels, involving different types of research, different types of sourcing, and different types of storytelling. What I sought to do in the book and what I continue to do as I work more on broader stories, broader histories of religion and energy, first of all, is to think about what oil meant to the nation itself. When was oil discovered here? And again, feel free to interrupt me too if you have questions as I start moving into more detail here. Anyone? 1850s, right, late 1850s. But it really kind of comes online as important to the economy, especially, of course, the North. Problems during the Civil War with cotton, of course. There needs to be other resources that can be profitable for the North, and oil becomes that. That resource is the great kind of darling of Lincoln's Washington administration. And it's during the Civil War then that Pennsylvania oil, Western Pennsylvania, really enters the American imagination, again, not just as liquid gold, even though it is that very much, but it becomes mythologized as salvific in its own right. It's in many ways the healing balm of the nation. Again, a highly polarized, a nation broken apart, but by 1865, and then certainly in the years immediately after the Civil War, Pennsylvania is the go-to place for anyone who is seeking, of course, to make a living. Many of these are veterans of the Civil War, North and South. But for the nation as a whole, it is seen as the fuel for American development, not just at home, but abroad. This is going to be the natural resource that captures the imagination, not just of Washington, but of the American people as a whole. By the late 19th, early 20th century, of course, the United States will indeed control this resource because of its outsized production of it, and also because of its ability to distribute and market globally, thanks in no small part, in large part, to John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. My point is to understand what happens in those years that follow, and the rise of American kind of global interaction and intervention in the early to mid 20th century, the rise of the American century, which reaches its crescendo in the mid 20th century, as one in which the imaginations, the potentials of oil are linked deliberately, explicitly to the notion of a mandate, a biblical, a divine mandate to spread Christian democracy abroad, to disentangle then the American century, to understand how that vision comes undone in the 1970s this is the crisis that Carter is speaking to, is in many ways to accept the fact that oil from its very beginning in this nation has been seen in these ultimate terms. Secondly, 20,000 feet. This is where I started the project, and that was to understand that competing corporate cultures of petroleum. We think of petroleum as big oil. We think of it in monolithic terms, when in fact it has always been deeply divided, and it has been highly competitive within its own ranks. And the two sectors that have defined this, and again, there are gray areas here, I don't want to overstate this, but are between major oil and independent oil. Major, of course, being those fully integrated companies, primarily Rockefeller companies in the late 19th, early 20th century, that had the capacity and the ability to go global, to be international, to control production right to marketing, every sector really of this industry. And this was represented not just in corporate terms, but in churchly terms as well. As I'll highlight in just a minute, the major oil kind of philosophy of combination, collective action, of providing a rational kind of model of capitalist growth was combined with what the Rockefellers considered essential also, and that was the ecumenical internationalist efforts of a mainline Protestantism, of a mainline American Christianity, one that was less worried about kind of the fiercely independent, individualistic approaches to salvation and more concerned with a social gospel, more concerned with changing the world here and now through the application of resources that can be shared across denominational lines. In essence, the Rockefellers are trying to create a type of Christian monopoly as well, of forward-looking progress through shared interests. The other side of this, of which I'm going to focus on, is the independent side, and these are the small independent oil producers who started in Pennsylvania, got squeezed out by Rockefeller and moved elsewhere. They are fervently independent, individualistic in their corporate practices. They are risk-taking, they're highly speculative. These are the people who are out on the frontier looking for new oil patches in North America. Is it any wonder that many, if not most of them, are also going to be fervently evangelical in the way that they view not just the corporate sector and the monopoly that Rockefeller possesses and advances, but also against kind of a more liberal mainline Protestantism as well. This is the level at which I started this project, Follow the Money. How do these different sectors of oil create different religious cultures within American Christianity? But the one that excited me most in the end was the final one, and I've already alluded to that, and that is the 10,000-foot grassroots view, and that is what does life look like? What does religious life look like? How is religious experience interpreted, encountered differently on an oil patch than it is elsewhere? And that's where I will shift my attention in just a minute. But these, really the bottom two levels here is where I found my own work being energized and animated by my own, again, encounters of local sources, the sources of men and women who were related in many ways to the oil business, but also highly invested in the direction of the Christian church, of the Protestant church especially, but also Catholic in the 20th century. Briefly, what about this major oil side of the equation? And we could talk at length about this, but I will try not to. I, again, welcome more questions at any point, certainly after I finish talking us through this. This major oil sector that was so invested in the expansion, internationalization of the industry itself was, again, responsible for so much of the 20th century expansion of U.S. interests abroad, trying to open up new terrains for exploration, open up new markets to sell products. And again, Standard Oil was driving this throughout. By the mid-20th century, by the 1940s, this sector of oil had indeed succeeded at placing kind of the stamp of its influence in all four corners of the globe. Backing this was, again, a philosophy that was highly religious in its tone and intentions. Henry Luce, anyone recall who Henry Luce is? Yes. Time magazine, famous publisher, the son of missionaries to China, right? This is someone who grew up on the mission field, who internalized both the imperatives of sharing the good news, but also the imperative of spreading Christian democracy, as well as, of course, capitalism. And famously, in the early 40s, he wrote an essay that defined the American century. This was a call in Life magazine for Americans at the beginning of World War II to remember that they had assumed special authority in the world. They were empowered in a way never seen before, witnessed before, to shape the post-war world in their image. This was the burden of accepting the American century. It's no accident that he first delivered what would become this essay in a speech to the American Petroleum Institute just a few months before, I believe in 1940, at which time he spoke about his audience in these, again, highly kind of moralistic as well as political and economic terms. Having within you a dynamic spirit of freedom and enterprise and a genius for cooperation and organization, it follows inevitably that you do not stop at the frontier of mountains or sea or jungle, nor at the man-made frontiers of knowledge or tradition or hope. For your sense of the illimitable roundness of the world, I salute you. Very much encapsulating the vision of major oil companies and their work abroad, but also doing so in a language that is steeped with religious meaning. And he would, of course, offer other quotes of that sort that were even more explicitly biblical in tone. He spoke for a whole generation of kind of proponents of major oil in a way that I would define as, and as I do in the book, as a civil religion of crude, a theology, a philosophy, a worldview that sees oil as a way for Americans to spread the good news, to encourage American involvement abroad for the spread of Christian democracy, and to see the oil industry itself as divinely ordained, as special in its own right. It's not coal. It's not other economic sectors. There's something mystical and magical about oil that has given America this right and this authority to be a leader in the world. Certainly the doctrinal, dogmatic kind of terms of this theology has been drained away. In its place, though, is still a highly Christian view of the world that sees America as assuming an exceptional, ordained status. Many individuals we could highlight. One maybe lesser known is William Eddy. Does that name ring a bell with anyone? William Eddy, again, in I think important ways encapsulates this side of the equation of oil's religious biography. Grew up in the Middle East. His parents were missionaries, like Luce. William Eddy grew up in Beirut, part of a community of missionaries, second generation, that had gone over the 19th century, ended up starting the American University of Beirut as a place to not just spread the Christian gospel, but increasingly to provide other training for locals in medicine, in engineering, and so forth. This was the way that you Christianized the world, that you spread the good news. It was not through the spread of a particular doctrine. It was about having influence in broader society through these different means. And William Eddy really embraced this, would go on to be a college professor in the late 30s before entering the service as for the OAS, what preceded the CIA, would carry out spying operations throughout North Africa. He was an Arabist at heart. Like so many of his peers, Protestant peers at the time, he supported the Arab cause. He was fluent in Arabic and was respectful of Islam. Very ecumenical and internationalist in his outlook. For that reason, he would become absolutely crucial to the American oil effort abroad. You can't see this, no doubt, but he's pictured below here, a famous picture of him in 1945. He is kneeling in front of Ibn Saud and Franklin D. Roosevelt. This is the deal that is carried out in the Suez Canal that ensures American privileged access to oil in Saudi Arabia. That would be the foundation, really, of what we now know today, and most explicitly the formation of Aramco, the company that was started by a couple of standard offshoots, Chevron, and I'm blanking on the other one. Is it Gulf? And then eventually, of course, handed over to the Saudis in the 1970s, early 80s, at this moment, once again, of transition in geopolitics. Because of Eddie's careful managing of this relationship was sealed, not just on principles of shared economic aspiration, of use of this resource, but also out of a shared respect for monotheism and kind of an ecumenical, universal brotherhood that Eddie was so powerful in articulating and so convincing. Not to put too much emphasis on that, but nevertheless, representative, I think, of what some of the most important major oil operations were at mid-century, Aramco being the most important. Pictures from Aramco in the 1950s, early 60s, of course, celebrating the place of religion as central to this production zone, of honoring the monotheism of Muslim workers, as well as those Protestant workers who came over from the oil patches of the United States to work this terrain. Overseeing the management, the cultural kind of management of this vast operation were countless other Arabists, like William Eddy, many of them trained in missionary homes, trained to embrace the religion and language of others, and to use that to help with the management of the day-to-day management of Aramco. Some of them were outstanding translators and would be offered major jobs in universities across the country, but theirs was kind of a secular missionary enterprise from the very beginning. And Aramco would succeed in no small part because of their ability to navigate. Not without troubles, of course, and we could certainly talk about those, especially as we get to the 60s. Finally, the family at in the background, of course, and certainly calling the shots early on, whose influence would have an outsized importance to this sector of oil and Christianity, are the Rockefellers. John D. Jr., of course, pictured on the left with his 5 sons. And from the early 20th century through to the mid to second half of the 20th century, the Rockefeller spirit of big oil and big Christianity, kind of an internationalist vision, ecumenical, collective, combined, would very much dictate not just the lives of oil through initiatives like Aramco, but would also inspire some of the most important ecumenical religious movements of the early 20th century. Formation of the World Council of Churches, different ecumenical organizations promoting both missions, but also the growth of expansion of medicine into China and so forth. This was the social gospel of the Rockefeller ethos that permeated American Christianity as a whole in the first half of the 20th century, and that even through the 5 sons, the third generation, would continue to shape American religion and oil and politics into the late 20th century. Nelson Rockefeller perhaps wasn't known as the most pious of the group. Nevertheless, he really bore the responsibilities of his father and his grandfather and their Baptist faith in some pretty explicit ways, seeing, again, the spread of American influence and the spread of Christian democracy as hand in hand. And the ability of oil to open up those opportunities was always clear to him. He, of course, got his start in the oil business working with Crail Oil in South America, was an oilman at heart, brought his expertise into Washington to help promote various development initiatives undertaken by Truman and Eisenhower. And again, always with an awareness that this needed to be carried out with a fervor that was religious, if not doctrinal and dogmatic, one that was nevertheless looking for a higher being and a higher sense of being among a universal brotherhood. Okay, back now to the oil patch. And this is where we'll pause a bit, and I will kind of try to get down to the 10,000 foot level here, and that is the other side of the equation, the wildcat side. What happens, how do we tell the religious biography of oil through this sector, the sector of independence, the sector of primarily kind of the evangelicals who are going to have a particularly outsized presence and import on the oil patches of America and of North America, including Alberta, where I grew up. Again, this is all me trying to make sense of myself, sorry. Who are these men? The wildcatters, of course, are those independents who were the most willing to take risks, to open up new terrain, to go drill wildcat drills with hope that there was going to be oil there. Highly risky, highly expensive, and it could be, of course, costly, could wipe out a career entirely. They were not backed in a way that the Rockefeller business was. Many of them, if not most, again, having spent so much time with their own biographies, leaned heavily on their own beliefs, heavily on their own kind of sense of purpose that was derived from their possession of Scripture, their hanging on to biblical principles, and their drive with the sense that they were, again, destined for greatness because God wanted it that way. Their own pursuits of oil took on a spiritual dimension as well. Early on in oil exploration, the science of geology was kind of late to catch up. What was the way to find oil? It was by smelling. It was by different spiritual devices, divining rods. There was a way in which even the exploration, the methods of exploration assumed a religiosity that was unusual for any other extractive industry of this sort. They embraced that, and they took it with them west of the Mississippi. You know the story. Any high schooler can tell you what Rockefeller did to the business. By 1890s, Standard Oil controls over 90% of the business, squashing each and every one of these independent producers, thousands of them in western Pennsylvania, driving them out of the business. So where do they go? They go west of the Mississippi. 1890, famously, infamously, John Archbold, one of the CEOs of Standard, boasted that he would drink every gallon of oil discovered west of the Mississippi, and that's how assured he was that it did not exist west of the Mississippi. We know the rest of the story, of course. First strikes happened, Southern California, Central Texas, Spindletop, pictured below, western Pennsylvania above, is the breakthrough in 1901, which brings the epicenter of oil production to Texas and the Southwest. This transforms the business globally. For the next 40 years, Texas will be in control of the global oil industry. And because the majors, because Standard was hesitant to invest so early, it would be the independents who would be on the ground first, and allowing them to take control of this terrain before Rockefeller came to stamp them out. And that allowed them to get their feet on the ground, to get their industry up and running, and to really impose their prerogatives, their wildcat spirit of capitalism and Christianity to this terrain. East Texas, of course, would in the 1930s become the most profound and the most important of these terrains, allowing wildcat Christianity to flourish. Fiercely, once again, independent, individualistic, both in terms of faith, in terms of personal encounter with the divine, an assurance that comes through one's personal relationship with Jesus Christ, spelled out also and acted upon in industry itself, where the fiercely individualistic wildcatter was the one that was to succeed, and to succeed brilliantly, and to succeed in many ways magically. So just to dwell on East Texas and to give you a sense again of how this plays out in one oil patch, not necessarily replicated elsewhere, but in East Texas, we will see a region, a terrain, a people that comes of age in this decade amid oil, gushing crude, and the sense of possibility that this resource and its extraction will provide long-term as well as short-term. The story itself, I don't know, has anyone read about the East Texas boom? Anyone been to East Texas? Yes? Okay. Piney Woods, tucked away region, poorest region of the country in 1930, which is what's happening, right? I mean, the Depression. And yet it's in that very place that this resource is going to appear suddenly and awaken again the most kind of poverty-inflicted people to the possibilities of not just crude, but of money and what it can mean for this community. It's a process that happens over a matter of months, several months. Dad Joyner, as he's called, is a wildcatter speculator who convinces a local farm woman to drill on her land. He's convinced oil is there. She believes him. And after months and months of trying, word starts to spread that there is something happening underneath the earth, that there is gurgling, that there are sounds coming out of the earth that are speaking to something spectacular. Sunday afternoons, typical people in their Sunday dress would get in their cars and drive to the drill site, have a picnic, and watch as the drillers did their work. No doubt humored by it, but also praying for what is to come next. And what does come next is absolutely mind-boggling. Give you a sense of the numbers. October 5th, 1930 is when we see the gurgling turn into something much more kind of awe-inspiring, and that is a full gushing well. Locals are watching it, and they are delirious. They think this is just absolutely, in their words, hilarious. People are celebrating in every manner. One guy pulled out his gun and started shooting in the air. Of course, he was tackled right away. That's not what you want to be doing around gas. But what was discovered was the largest oil lake in history, 43 miles long, 10 miles wide, containing 5.5 billion barrels of crude. This is at the very beginning of the Depression. For the next decade and a half, it would put East Texas on the map. And as you can imagine, thousands and thousands of people descend on this region to towns like Kilgore here, pictured by 1940, just a jungle of oil derricks. Is it any wonder then that this event is going to transform this region, a region that is granted already highly religious in its Baptist and Pentecostal faith, but that is going to be accentuated by its encounter with this material form? What happens, and how do we think about the wildcat faith that emerges, the fervent evangelical faith that emerges is in response to this happening? A couple of different components of this. A prosperity gospel, you might have heard that term in relation to modern Pentecostalism, but this really is the beginning of a prosperity gospel. The belief that God, through mysterious ways, will release wealth to the most unexpected. But should you believe it, you too can embrace the power that comes through that discovery of money. Again, celebrating the speculative and supernatural dimensions of faith, oil, and the market. Good Christians, East Texans would come to believe, were to spend more energy riding the whims of oil than trying to discipline them. Drill, drill, drill became a biblical mandate for them at this time. A prosperity gospel that was legitimated by the rise of independent oilmen. H.L. Hunt, pictured here with the hat, is the one who would purchase the land on which the first well was drilled successfully. again, you know the rest of the story of the Hunt family. Perhaps you've read a quite well-known book about the Texas Rich. Four of the most imposing independent oilmen would have their roots in East Texas at this time. Clint Murkison, Sid Richardson, and others. These are fiercely independent oil producers who will also become absolutely crucial to the mythology of the prosperity gospel in this place. And then churches themselves. How do you not go to worship with the sounds of the oil derricks surrounding you and not come to believe in the supernatural power of crude and what it can do for you? In Longview, Texas, one of the epicenters of the East Texas oil patch, every one of the churches rebuilt in the 1930s, getting rid of their shacks and going for the Gothic style. Gothic style ruled in East Texas in the 1930s. It's a democratic dream. African-American oilman Jake Simmons was one of the first on the scenes. Of course, this is a highly racialized terrain, one with challenges of Jim Crow and so forth, but oil in his case allowed him in many ways to level the playing field and to use his funds, oil funds, to enhance, expand his African-American Methodist denomination throughout the region and other initiatives of the sort. Here is where even the lowest in the social strata could, through discovery, kind of reimagine their futures. Finally, two other essentials to this that are important to what comes next. An eschatology of calamity. I mentioned my own background growing up in an evangelical church in Alberta. Premillennialist, the notion that Christ is going to return at any moment and is going to do so amid the trials of this earth, is absolutely essential to evangelical end times belief. Why focus on improving our social situation here and now when our vision should be set on heaven beyond? This was an eschatology that resonated with those living in East Texas at the time. The Lord giveth and taketh as he wishes. We are here to do our best during the trials as well as the good times, to be Christians with our sights set on heaven beyond. Oil was calamitous in every way. You could not live and even sit on your porch without the technology of it imposing itself on you. Yes? Oh, do you have a question?
I can wait, but I wonder if you're going to put this in perspective to what was happening in the country before the 1930s and then the Great Depression, the sandstorms. I grew up not down in Texas, but I heard stories since I was a young kid that how my grandparents and everyone lost everything they had when the crops.
Sure.
The sandstorms, the dust storms, the droughts, it was boom to bust too,
Sure. I mean, this was a,
immigrants and,
right.
the wildcat prosperity sounds negative to me, but it sounds like it was a blessing to.
Oh, of course it was. No, I don't mean to. I mean, it was a negative in the way that it unleashed a certain chaotic kind of free-for-all in the oil fields of East Texas, which did a disservice to everyone because it basically, the pressure dropped, basically the wells could not be managed properly, which actually left a lot of wasted oil in the ground. And so this was a free-for-all zone, and it created, of course, magical thinking, but it also could have benefited from some type of oversight at the local level. But your point is of course, a good one. This is a depression. This is a region, the heart of the country, that is experiencing hardship in many different forms, environmentally, economically, which again is all the more reason why this particular area is seen as a life source, as the answer to the problems. People moving from Kansas to East Texas, people moving from other areas. But it's part of, again, what is happening more broadly at this time. New London, this is the most devastating crisis to happen. 1937, there was a high school built in New London, Texas, with oil and gas money, $1 million building. It's seen as really the prize of public education across the country. In 1937, because of underlying gas lines underneath, it explodes, and it is the worst industrial accident up to that time. In fact, it's because of this explosion that the government mandates that all gas have an odor to it so that it can be, of course, sensed when it's present. 300 young people died, a third of the underage population of this town. Leaders from around the world, including Adolf Hitler, sent telegrams expressing their sorrow. Walter Cronkite, this is one of his first kind of assignments, came from Dallas to report on it, and had never seen, of course, anything like it. Absolutely devastating. But again, kind of affirming for locals that with the boom bust came lots of tragedy and hurt as well. All the more reason to rely on God, to rely on the supernatural. Finally, a spirit of rebellion. J. Howard Pugh and Sunoco would become crucial to this story. J. Howard Pugh, perhaps you're familiar, an oilman from Western Pennsylvania. His family started Sun Oil, almost driven out of existence by Rockefeller. Sun Oil is among the first, or Sunoco, on the ground in East Texas, and he is able, therefore, to restart Sunoco and make it really one of the darlings of the independent or mid-independent oil companies in the region, are seen really as Texas-based. He is going to take his leadership, not just in the oil industry, but in the Presbyterian Church, seriously, and is going to fashion kind of the wildcat ethic into a mandate for religious growth, for the growth of evangelical institutions. He's also going to see it as a political mandate to challenge the New Deal liberal order that is descending at this same time. Because of oil and the chaos of East Texas, Franklin D. Roosevelt is going to impose regulations on the area. Harold Ickes is his Secretary of Interior, is going to be placed in charge of this. That is going to, of course, stir up resentment among independent oilmen like J. Howard Pugh. And this is going to be very much influential in generating an anti-New Deal liberal political movement that is going to rise in the 1950s and 60s and really have its kind of revolution of sorts by the late 70s, early 1980s. All right, let's take briefly a story, and I'll just wrap up because I know we will probably have some questions here. What happens after East Texas crescendos and eventually dissipates in the mid-1940s? At this juncture, of course, Aramco and American major oil companies are focusing increasingly internationally. Domestic oilmen and their churches are decrying the move of American interests abroad at the cost of domestic production and the concerns of the grassroots at the local level in places like Texas. Into this milieu in the late 40s, early 50s, we see J. Howard Pugh starting increasingly to fund what would be known as the new evangelical movement of the post-World War II period. And again, this is not about just following the money, but to understand how what happens to evangelicalism as a whole in the post-World War II period is in no small way shaped by the prerogatives of wildcat Christianity and by the influence of so many small oil producers who make it big in East Texas. No one less important or more important than J. Howard Pugh. Pugh will use Sunoco funds through his philanthropy, the Charitable Trust, to fund Christianity Today, which becomes the most popular evangelical magazine of the time, really to the present day. Will support famous evangelical preachers like Charles Fuller, who would have a radio program and become an important leader of this new evangelical movement. And perhaps most importantly, J. Howard Pugh and Billy Graham would become kind of a dynamic duo in the 1950s, 1960s. Billy Graham himself recognizes what Texas stands for, what Southwestern oil stands for in the imagination of evangelicals, in the imagination of the country as a whole. And we'll partner with J. Howard Pugh to spread, again, a gospel of evangelicalism that is very much in tune with some of the tenets that rise in importance during the 1930s in places like East Texas. We can talk more about Billy Graham. He's pictured here at the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, which really is the heart and soul of wildcat Christianity, if you will, in this region. Many of the most influential oilmen attend there. Graham will take membership there, will also become a popular speaker across the region. That's a signal. Happy to talk more about how this spreads economically, but we've got discoveries of the Gulf of Mexico and Alberta, which help enhance kind of the spread of this wildcat evangelical empire, if you will, economically. One of the most important for anyone who's grown up in Alberta, pictured here, of course, is the Athabasca oil sands. The Great Canadian Oil Sands was a project that J. Howard Pugh actually invested in. 1952, he puts down $250 million to start the oil sands project. This is the largest private investment in Canadian history up to that point. And the way he comes to kind of take ownership of this terrain and to invest in the experimental kind of production of the oil sands, the refining of it into oil, is through partnership with Ernest Manning, Premier of Alberta, who is a deeply religious evangelical man in his own right, one of the longest serving politicians in Canadian history, and also through Billy Graham, who is kind of the go-between friend of both Ernest Manning, J. Howard Pugh, using their connections through the church really to facilitate what would become the most momentous oil exploratory invention in Canadian history. Of course, still operational today in ways that no one could have imagined at that point. All right, I'm going we can talk how this kind of plays out politically. Barry Goldwater versus Nelson Rockefeller is perhaps one of those signature moments in 1964, where what we see is in some ways not just the culmination, but a pivot point in the life, not just of American religion and politics, but in the life of the Republican Party itself. The Wildcatters embrace Barry Goldwater, who speaks for them, again, a fiercely libertarian, who also stands for values that wildcat oilmen and evangelicals of the Southwest can embrace. And his victory over Nelson Rockefeller really signals a shift, if you think about long-term, of the power in oil, the power in the church, and the power in the Republican Party to a movement that would only grow in influence throughout the 1970s and would lead to the kind of pivot point that would happen shortly after Jimmy Carter delivered his malaise speech. Ronald Reagan would come and speak to the American public and say malaise has no place in our lexicon. And he would speak directly, especially to evangelicals across the Southwest. During the 1980 campaign, he would speak to oil associations on one hand, boasting and propping up the prerogatives of domestic oil production. We're going to open up terrains for you so that you can go explore. On the next day, the next evening, speaking to local religious leaders that he will support, of course, traditional family values. In this juncture then, at this juncture, family and fuel values are fused together. And so often as historians, we look at that moment as far as evangelicals are concerned as only about social values, right? This is what turned them from a Carter to a Reagan, and there's truth in that, of course. My minor intervention here is to say energy has always mattered as well, oil especially to this place and to its people. And is it any wonder then that when the Reagan Revolution of 1980 happened, it was not just for one or the other, but a combination of social and energy policies. Ronald Reagan would reward evangelicals by placing James Watt, as I am covering him, as Secretary of the Interior. This is a story of Roosevelt to Reagan. It's a story of Harold Ickes to James Watt. And again, forcing us, I think, James Watt, a very conservative Pentecostal from the West, who again saw it as a mandate of Americans having to do oil exploration on their own terrain and to make that feasible. We can, happy to open up more, but I'll just close now with the overarching theme here, which I hope you get by now. There is a change. There is a narrative of religious and political change in this country since the 1850s and 1860s that I think only makes sense if we bring petroleum and religion together at the heart of the story. It raises, of course, questions about today, about changes happening, about challenges of today, and I think there too, to be sensitive to kind of the sacred meaning of this resource and the way it especially resonates with people living in energy zones uniquely, differently, powerfully, is, I hope, to open up conversations today across the spectrum and in the pulpits and pews of America and North America. Again, as I said, as I was able to talk about the book, I was able to travel the oil patch again, where some were questioning the fracking and questioning some of the latest techniques in this industry, while also, as I saw on many cars in Alberta a couple years ago, the celebration of oil and gas as God-given. Fortunate to say, and I'm happy to say that even in presenting my findings to so many different church groups and communities, that the response by and large was for people across the spectrum, across the aisle, to talk in civil terms about just what this resource has meant to them, not just, again, in terms of economics and labor and politics, but what it has meant to the life of their own churches as well. I will finish with a quote from someone else who looked to energy in the late 70s as something more than material. Jimmy Carter was one. Wendell Berry, perhaps some of you are familiar with him and his writings, an agrarian advocate who wrote in 1970 about energy itself. First of all, he said, energy is not just technical or material or technological. Quote, technology joins us to energy, to life. It is not, as many technologists would have us believe, a simple connection. Our technology is the practical aspect of our culture. By it, we enact our religion or lack of it. Second quote, energy is itself a force to be reckoned with. And he states in this regard, quote, in speaking of the use of energy, then, we are speaking of an issue of religion, whether we like it or not. Religion in the root sense of the word is what binds us back to the source of life. To receive energy is at once to live and to die. That's the message I'll leave with you. Hopefully more uplifting than the other one, but maybe not. But thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions you may have or fill in gaps.
Let me just ask one question.
Mm-hmm.
What moral responsibility does our generation have to our children and grandchildren and generations unborn in terms of managing a finite resource?
Great question. And
Very smart, 3 hour.
right. Well, no, and I have, don't need to rehash all my visits to different oil patch communities. I did one talk in Houston, though, that was one half of the room worked for Exxon, and the other half were environmentalists, and so it was a tough to, and they're not quite fisticuffs, but in any case, I'm happy to say that my experience working with young people, for instance, and this is kind of where I highlight the Catholic dimension of this. I teach at Notre Dame, and so there's a responsibility on one hand, for you to engage this, and I hope you would, in terms that are, kind of aware of this fuller history that I've sought to tell, to see all sides here as engaging in matters of deep importance that go beyond again the technical and the economic or the questions of progress and so forth, but get to the existential as well. My point is, young people are already processing it in those terms, I think, and my encounter with college-age students at Notre Dame, this is a deeply Catholic place of where faith is embraced and taken seriously. It can be discussed in the classroom. My favorite class, other than teaching the 1970s, is to teach history of energy in American life, and it's mostly engineers who take that course. And they are, first of all, excited to think about such things in humanity, in terms of the humanities, in terms of the human experience, in terms of belief, in terms of practice. And secondly, they are excited to leave Notre Dame to transform. And many of them are working for large oil companies in Texas, and within those companies are kind of shaping the direction of the oil industry into other renewables and so forth, or more broadly, just seeing their engagement with civil society in terms that blend the scientific with the sacred, and to see life in those holistic terms, and to view next steps for society in those terms. So, all that's to say is I'm encouraged by what's happening in the classrooms already, and that's not from the instructors, it's not from the parents, it's happening organically across not just campus of Notre Dame, but others as well. So I don't know if that helps, but. Mm-hmm.
I happened to live in western Pennsylvania in the early 60s for a few years. Spent a lot of time around Titusville, where the first
Uh-huh.
was, and Oil City, Franklin, Clarion, in that area. And well, it became Appalachia, and the spirit in that area of the country was really down. I don't know what's happened since for a lot of years, and there were a lot of churches, a lot of churches in those towns, but it's just kind of the opposite of probably the spirit taking place in Texas.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Religious point of view.
Yeah, well, that's the other side of the coin that, thinking about even East Texas, I mean, with the boom came inevitable bust, and people living in those terrains actually, sense that. I mean, Alberta in the early 80s, right? I mean, this was a downtime, and people kept saying, Lord, give me another boom. This time I won't squander it away, right? And this is, and sure enough, they're right back at it. Another cycle has come. And so from a kind of academic-y perspective, what I'm trying to say is that actual boom-bust cycle, in fact, accentuates and enhances kind of the DNA of the wildcat mythology, right? This is, or theology. This is, we need to make hay while we can. We need to build our churches, spread the gospel, because the end is coming. And in some ways, it kind of legitimates that philosophy. That's one part of it. But more importantly for me, thinking about the role of churches in these areas, but also, first of all, to think about the damage done without a responsible approach to extraction, whether it's coal, oil, what have you. And for church folk to be part of those conversations and to be thinking in terms that make the church open to those conversations. Secondly, to think about how do we envision a new future for places like Appalachia, is to draw on some of the entrepreneurialism and some of the spirit of that place to imagine a better future. Thinking about the oil patch in either or terms, I think also somewhat misguided. I mean, oil means so much to people in my hometown. To dismiss it as easily remedied or transitioned into something else is not doing justice to the ways in which their livelihoods, including that which happens in the pews of their churches, matters to them, and it matters to them in relation to this resource. So, yeah.
So you were talking about the connection of oil and Christianity. Well, now environmental mentalists trying to put cap on oil and the decline of Christianity. Do you find a correlation between those two?
Great question. It's not necessarily a correlation, and this is where I put on my historian's hat all the time in defense, because I really am much more comfortable looking backward than forward. And the last slide, or one of the last slides I had was to see this trajectory, fourth, fifth generation Rockefellers now calling for divestment of oil, right? Working against, in some ways, or challenging the very industry that their ancestors created. One of the agencies helping support protest against the oil sands in Alberta is the Pew Charitable Trust, which again, J. Howard Pew is probably rolling in his grave to think that the very kind of experiment that he created through millions and millions of dollars is now being challenged by some of his ancestors. So, and there's a way in which that's irony, but as the Rockefellers would say, they're in fact tapping the entrepreneurialism and initiative and forward-looking kind of gospel that their great-grandfather embraced to build oil. They're looking to build other things through that same initiative. So it's not, again, not necessarily an either-or, but I think ways in the middle to envision a future that is kind of less confrontational. So I don't know, if that answers. I mean, I think at Notre Dame, for instance, many of the most earnest Catholic young people I see there are environmentalists. They are looking for sustainability as a mandate. The Pope himself is calling on that, but they're still upholding a set of conservative social values that you would see as traditional. And I don't think in that case they see any rupture between those two or necessary rupture between those two. So, yeah, all that's to say is historians are known to do is it's complicated.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dochuk. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.